Great. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to all of you for joining the virtual launch of the July-August issue of Foreign Affairs. I'm Dan Kurtz-Phelan. I'm the executive editor of Foreign Affairs. We felt like we had something of an embarrassment of riches in trying to decide which of our authors in the issue we wanted to feature this morning. There's a really sweeping and enraging piece by the epidemiologist Michael Osterholm called "The Chronicle of a Pandemic Foretold." A couple of really important essays by one by Prime Minister Lee of Singapore on the costs of U.S.-China competition, one by U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, a couple of really good review essays by Amy Chua and Arvind Subramanian and others. And I, as always, encourage you to read the whole issue. But we wanted to, for this event, feature two of the essays in the cover package, The World After the Pandemic, with authors who both in different ways get at this really fundamental question I think we've been grappling with since the pandemic started, and again, since the killing of George Floyd and the discussion that's followed and the protests that have followed. This question of what the pandemic and its fallout means for our political systems, for democracy, for political order more broadly. So really thrilled to have Danielle Allen and Francis Fukuyama with us this morning. Danielle is a political theorist who is the James Bryant Conant University professor at Harvard, where she also runs the Edmund J. Soffer Center for Ethics. Both of our guests have too many notable books to mention in this context, so I won't go over them. But two other things I wanted to mention about Danielle. She was just awarded the Kluge Prize in the Study of Humanity from the Library of Congress, which is sort of the Nobel Prize for the humanities, and she's going to, as part of this, be running an effort by the library called Our Common Purpose, which will be focused on promoting civic strength among the public. So very much related to the essay she did for Foreign Affairs, which is called A More Resilient Union. And she's also been leading a working group on pandemic response that brings together public health experts and economists and activists and a kind of really wide range of thinkers and voices, laying out the kind of comprehensive plan that you might want to see coming out of the federal government, but is perhaps not coming out of the usual authorities right now. So I would not normally recommend white papers as summer reading, but in this case, it really is worth looking at some of the plans that they've been doing. And then we have as well Frank Fukuyama, based now at Stanford, where he, among much else, directs the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and teaches political science. Again, more important books than I can mention here, but particularly relevant in this context are the two volumes he's done on the history of political order, and which really, I think, underlie the analysis that is in his piece, which is called The Pandemic and Political Order. So thanks so much, Danielle and Frank, for joining us. A bit of housekeeping, just a reminder again that we are on the record, so that includes your questions. The three of us will talk for the next 30 minutes or so, and then we will open it up to all of you. Please keep in mind that we will have something over 1,000 Council on Foreign Relations members and Foreign Affairs subscribers with us today. So we will try to get to as many questions as possible. But it will, of course, not be all of them. But please, when you're asking questions, be relatively brief and to the point. So to start, it's, of course, distressingly apt that we are having this conversation at a moment when COVID cases are rising again in the United States. We're all pretty familiar with the fairly damning comparative statistics, putting this country among the worst hit in terms of per capita deaths. And there are still a few European countries that have higher per capita death rates, but unlike those, we in the United States have not really seen major declines since the peak in the spring. Both of you have spent your careers studying political systems and governance and why they work or don't work the way they do. So to start, I'd love to hear from both of you your diagnosis of the underlying causes of the underwhelming American response so far, and especially what, if anything, about it has surprised you given the work you've been doing for the preceding decades, long before we imagined something like this would happen. So Danielle, let's start with you, then we'll go to Frank.
Sure. Well, for me, the most surprising thing is that our federal system should have been a major asset for us in this response. For disease response, it very much matters that it be tailored to local context and circumstance. There's been a great diversity of experience across the country, even as we're seeing now, where, for example, Texas, Oklahoma, Arizona have rising case rates, whereas New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts have falling case rates. So you do really need to be able to tailor the response point to point to a locale. Germany has a federal system that was very effective for it. So in the beginning, when the White House sort of directed response in a federal direction, there was nothing inherently wrong with that decision. But what flowed from that then was, from my point of view, a just comprehensive failure of governance. The federal government failed to understand its role in a harmonized federal system. It failed to provide the kind of supports needed for the states to take on their roles effectively. And so we ended up in the sort of economic space having competitions around supply chains, never actually resolving the supply chain problems around testing and PPE and other kinds of elements like that, failing to disseminate knowledge effectively so that states could build on knowledge resources to lay out the sort of end-to-end infrastructure response, and so on. And relatedly, inside of states, the sort of links between city government, county government, state governments also didn't function in a sort of harmonized way, often conflicts between the city and county level and the state level and that sort of thing. So there's a lot more to be said about the nature of that governance failure, but the machinery itself was not the problem. What was the problem was our ability to know how to use the machinery to achieve a shared diagnosis of the problem, a common purpose with regard to strategy of response, and then real clarity about the implementation and implementation roles at all levels for that response.
One thing that I thought was really powerful about your piece is that you know, some of the targets are obvious and very much in the headlines, but you also turn that analysis on the broader public and the kind of failures of our society as a kind of civic culture to rise to that occasion. So could you say a bit about the analysis of the piece that gets at that underlying issue which relates to governance?
Sure. So the basic work of governance, as I see it, is to be able to identify the problem that needs to be solved for a collectivity, for a political society, to diagnose the problem and then figure out the implementation pathway for a solution. The diagnosis element requires integrative judgment. So the problem that we faced was a health problem, and there were scientific elements to it. It was also an economics problem. It was also a problem pertaining to civic liberties, civil liberties, and so forth. All of these elements. And from the get-go, we should have been asking the question of, what's the policy solution that permits us to align our objectives across the health space, the economic space, the civil liberties space? We actually never asked that question. We started from the get-go presuming a trade-off. You shouldn't presume a trade-off before you've explored whether alignment is possible. And so it was the job of the society as a whole to recognize the need for an integrative conversation, to hold elected officials to account for having an integrated conversation, and to hold elected officials to account for making an integrative judgment about how to align our health objectives, our economic objectives, our civil liberties objectives. And again, that whole process of diagnosing towards a set of shared objectives didn't happen.
Frank, let me put the same question to you. What do you think accounts for the failures here, and what, if anything, about those failures surprised you, given the work you've done over the course of your career?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. So I think that the single biggest weakness of the United States as a society is its polarization. I think, this obviously is something that began long before Donald Trump. I think the president has contributed to it. Now, normally, if you look at polarized societies and you say, well, what gets you out of this polarization? You'd say, well, it has to be some emergency, some external shock that affects the country as a whole. And a pandemic is a perfect example of something that ought to shock us out of that polarization. And I guess what's surprising is that just didn't happen. It didn't happen from the get-go. And in fact, the polarization, I think, completely undermined the response. And so it began with the president, who, for the first 2 months and, really until the second or third week of March, kept denying that this was even a problem. But, if you look at the discourse on the right, it was completely, conspiratorial, saying that this wasn't a real crisis, that it was something that was just being conjured up by the opponents of the president. And that's just continued, and it's deepened, actually, as the crisis has continued. So then it shifted from, do we actually have a pandemic, to how quickly should we open up? And it's now, reached the point where something like wearing a mask, which is not a huge violation of individual liberty, has become this cultural symbol where people on the right simply don't want to wear a mask because they don't want to identify with the other tribe. And this is one of these things where that tribal identification has overwhelmed people's rational self-interest. So if you're going to a big demonstration against shutdowns, or you're going to one of these rallies like the ones we've seen in Arizona, it's in your personal interest to protect yourself. But people are so convinced, and so this is what's really, I guess, the ultimate surprise is the cognitive one, where the tribalism goes so deep that the kind of facts that people accept are not shared any longer, and people's perception of what's going on in the world is completely different depending on which side of this divide you're on. So I guess that's really what I find both surprising and very discouraging.
And I suppose you could add to that the differentiated impact in terms of the communities that really suffered from the pandemic. And
yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, so this is a pandemic that hit the blue states first, and it hit places with dense populations, big cities, large minority populations. And so if you lived in Wyoming or Montana, you didn't see anybody around you getting sick, and so you could actually plausibly think that this actually wasn't something that was real. Now that it's rising in red states, we're facing this very interesting moment where the cognitive dissonance is getting wider and wider and wider, and people are now seeing people around them getting sick, and at a certain point, it seems to me things are going to snap because that dissonance can't get so large that you're just denying things that are right in front of your face. So it'll be an interesting test when conservatives begin realizing that they'd made mistakes, and once that happens, I think there'll be a cascade of recriminations and so forth.
Frank, your piece, like so much of your work, has this incredible kind of comparative sweep. And looking around the world, there are, of course, lots of places, lots of countries that did better than the United States did. When you look at those cases, what do you see as the kind of common thread, or what accounts for success, whether it's in East Asia or elsewhere? I mean, what should we learn from those cases?
Well, the first thing to say is it's not correlated with democracy or authoritarian government. I think that if you look in both categories, you'll see some countries that did very well and some that did extraordinarily poorly. And so that's a wrong conclusion. I would say that there's several factors. I mean, political scientists are going to be studying this for years to come, but I would say off the bat, one factor that's really important, obviously, is state capacity. If you don't have the public health system, the trained nurses, doctors, public health officials, you're not going to do well. But the other thing has to do with this combination of trust and leadership. In countries that have a high degree of trust in their governments and trust in fellow citizens, you've tended to do very well. And in countries that are either highly polarized or in which people are distrustful of the state, you're going to do very badly. Now, what's really interesting is what's going on in Latin America right now, because this is a region of the world where trust in the state is very low. You have countries with very large parts of the population that are informal, meaning they're completely disconnected to the state. They don't believe the government when it tells them things. And so countries like Peru, that actually looked like they were doing very well early on, they had early shutdowns, are now, finding themselves in a disastrous situation because their systems are overwhelmed. But I think it's driven ultimately by the fact that people really don't believe the government, and they don't really, see the logic of what the state is trying to do.
And the common thread, as you see it in the East Asian countries, that some of which are democracies, some authoritarian systems that did well, is that trust in state capacity, even if it's
it's that, and that's true also of a lot of especially Northern European countries that have a high degree of both social and political consensus. But in all of these places, you don't have this American tradition of intense distrust of the state per se. People believe that the state is actually there to help them, and so they start off with a greater predisposition to believe public authorities, and that's particularly true in East Asia, where state authority is much more deeply rooted than in Europe or the United States or any other part of the world.
Danielle, your piece is, of course, focused on the United States and the failures here, but in your work, do you see examples of countries where they have gotten this sense of civic purpose right? What accounts for the models that work in the ways that are don't? And especially, do you see cases where this sense of purpose has been restored, right? Where we've had this the kind of decay that seems to have happened in the United States in recent years, and where they have in fact restored some sense of common civic purpose and identity.
Well, I want to start by saying that I think Frank's first point about the fact that success is not something that correlates to whether you're a democracy or an authoritarian regime is fundamental. So we have seen democracies that have succeeded and democracies that have failed. So yes. And I think the other thing I would put on the table, in addition to the issues of state capacity and trust in government, actually is age. So actually, Frank, I'd be curious to know what you think about this, but it looks to me like the old democracies of the world have failed and the young democracies have done just fine. So the US, the UK, France, Italy, not so great. Germany, much better. Scandinavian nations. Brazil, not so great. It's actually an old democracy. We forget that it's an old democracy. At any rate, that's a very rough sort of initial intuition, but I want to probe it a little bit more because I do think there are some critical differences. The older democracies have a sort of institutional footprint that predates the emergence of social rights as a concept. The young democracies have a concept of social rights fully woven into their core structure. I think this relates to the question of state capacity with regard to domains like health. So that would be something that I would wonder about. And relatedly, I think the older democracies do have that different conception of the relationship between citizen and state. So the US certainly has it in spades, but that came from something that was also familiar in the English context, the UK, and they have had their own struggles with that. World War II transformed Britain in various ways, but at any rate, so I think that's something to explore. So yes, I mean, we've seen success in Taiwan, we've seen success in South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, Germany, and that trust, that underlying infrastructure matters. I think the important thing that people should take away from that is to recognize that solidarity and the achievement of a sense of common purpose are concrete resources. They are as valuable as material resources, revenue, economic capacity, infrastructure, and so forth. The reason for this is because for a constitutional democracy to succeed in meeting a crisis, it needs to succeed by tapping into voluntarism, right? So that's the kind of core contrast between what a democracy needs and an authoritarian state needs. It doesn't want to achieve compliance through enforcement. It wants to achieve compliance to a maximal degree through voluntarism. And the way to achieve that is through resources of solidarity. That means you have to pay attention to all the things that you're doing in your society that sustain resources of solidarity. For me, what this results in is kind of a fundamental question about the health of the social compact in the older democracies, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and so forth. So I think where we've seen success, you've seen a more resilient social compact, a sense that people are committed to their fellow members of the society, that they recognize that the government is committed to them, that there is a sort of broad sense of mutual commitment. So for me, the real question is how, in a place like the US, do we actually go about revisiting the question of what a healthy social compact is? How do we find the resources to sustain a healthy social compact?
No, Danielle, I agree with that completely. I think this crisis may actually present an opportunity to rethink that social compact because it's obviously been so frayed, and I think the pandemic has revealed that. There's another correlation that I think needs to be thought about a little bit, which is between populism and bad responses, because it's not true that there's an overall correlation between democracy and poor response, but it does seem to me that there's something of a pattern between populist democratic systems with populist leaders. And I'm thinking specifically of the United States, Brazil, and Mexico. So each of them has a populist leader who share a number of characteristics. So one is a kind of very personalistic approach to governing. They don't care about institutions. It's all about them and their personal charisma. And that kind of a leader does not like to be associated with failure. And so in all three cases, you have leaders who have denied that this is really a problem. They keep stressing economic issues because that is what they believe is really going to make them win the next election. And in between Mexico and Brazil, Manuel Lopez Obrador is on the left and Bolsonaro is on the right. But in a way, their responses have been very, very similar to one another. And so that, I think, is something that, in a strange way may actually be a good thing in the future, because this wave of populism was something that I think was threatening liberal institutions all over the world. And the abject failure of that style of leadership, is something that may have consequences for the survival of that type of regime.
Frank, can I ask you to react to Danielle's point about the age of democracies as well? Does that strike you as valid? And
clearly, the older the democracy is, the more embedded your belief in institutions. The only problem is the United States, which really is now the democracy with the longest continuous history of constitutional government. And I must say, not just in this pandemic, but in general, I had never thought that the basic principles of rule of law would really be challenged in any kind of serious way, and yet we've seen that happen repeatedly, and it's been intensifying, after the pandemic has started. And so I do think that a lot of our assumptions of what, political scientists used to have this concept of a consolidated democracy. So if you had, 2 or 3 elections where you had a turnover of leadership to another party, you say, okay, you're consolidated, that's fine, you're in the club, and you're not going to go backwards. And unfortunately, I just think that our experience and that of a number of other countries around the world has indicated that that's not such a great, you're not safe. There's no point at which you can't experience political decay and start to go backwards.
So I think just to clarify, to sort of add one wrinkle there, I think the suggestion I'm making is not so much a falling back as a regrettable progress forward into sclerosis. So that's the question I'm really asking about older democracies. So it's true that they have embedded institutionalism, but my concern is that the machinery of the institutions is no longer functioning effectively, which is a sort of slightly different problem than decay of commitment to them. I think that problem exists as well. But the thing that really struck me was the sense in which folks really didn't actually see how to operate the links between federal government, state governments, county, city, and so forth. Those links were all there to be operated. So there's sort of an atrophy of understanding among our elected leaders and in the citizenry generally about how the machinery ought to work, and an atrophy of sort of capacity with regard to identifying when the machinery are occasions for judgment. So in other words, the point of the machinery is really to support an activity that we might call judgment, right? Again, that sort of diagnostic and solution generating capacity I was trying to describe. Yet what we had instead of a sort of process of integrating the kind of different kinds of expertise, asking the big question, what should be our strategy? Should our strategy be to just slow the spread, or should it be to actually suppress the disease? We didn't actually ever ask that question. And instead, we sort of presumed that sort of technocratic answers should just deliver a solution, that there wasn't a need for the space of kind of integrating judgment. And so that's my worry, that what the machinery is for has disappeared from view, as well as the specific knowledge about how to operate it. As a result of those two things, it's less nimble and flexible than it would otherwise be, and hence my word sclerosis.
Yeah, no, that I agree with completely. I think the system has gotten way too rigid, and a lot of it is being taken for granted, and that really needs a big rethink.
Both of you, in slightly different ways, get at this question of the information and media environment, the kind of cognitive environment that we're operating in. And Frank, you are very pessimistic in your piece, and I think more broadly about both the kind of weaponized babble that is much of the kind of public debate right now, as you put it, and you rue the democratization of authority and lack of kind of technocratic unified voice in the delivery of information. Danielle, I think you have a slightly different view of what the solution is likely to be, and see more opportunity for kind of grassroots renewal there. So I'm curious for your reactions from both of you on the ways that technology and the media environment make this task harder or easier, given where we are now.
Well, when the internet appeared in the 1990s, everybody thought it was great because it was going to blow away all of the intermediaries like publishers and editors and established and governments and all sorts of gatekeepers for information. And in fact, it's done that. And it turns out that world isn't such a great world, because you actually need sources of credible information, which are basically institutions that have the capacity and the trust built into them to be information providers. And that whole structure has, I think, been eroding. And I think that, a lot of the digital platforms that now govern so much of our lives have assisted in that, because their business models have tended to focus on things that are popular and get clicks rather than things that are authoritative. And so that's, I think, the general background to the information world that we're living in right now, where anyone can say anything. We used to celebrate that. Anyone can be their own publisher. Well, that's happened, and I think that's what's really led to this decay of authoritative information. And I think if you don't have commonly agreed on facts and a common cognitive framework for dealing with public policy problems, you're in trouble as a democracy.
Danielle, is that too pessimistic? Do you see more opportunity here?
I don't think it's too pessimistic as a diagnosis of where we are. For me, I'm always, I describe myself as not an optionist. That is to say, I'm not exactly an optimist, but failure is not an option, so I'm not an optionist. So I think that diagnosis is accurate, and so therefore I think the job is to figure out the solution. So the way I tend to put it is we have gotten really fixated on social media and what life is like inside the communications ecosystem that it delivers. And we don't actually have to be stuck inside it. We might, in fact, build an alternative. I like to say the alternative we should call civic media, so that we can begin to make it clear that social media is like being in middle school. That's more or less what the experience is like. And so we need to build something alongside it that's a clear alternative. And there are grassroots examples. My favorite, people know I tend to point to this one, is something in Lexington, Kentucky called Civic Lex. This is a media platform that is filling a news desert. We all know that there's been incredible erosion of local news, local investigative journalism, local explanatory journalism, coverage of state houses and city governments and so forth. So we talk about food deserts, we have to recognize news deserts in exactly the same way. And so what Civic Lex has done is taken all the tools of media platforms and started delivering investigative journalism, explanatory journalism in a local context. What's the city council doing? What is sort of county level water management doing? It's supported by philanthropy, so that is a different business model than we have traditionally had. But in addition to filling that news desert, the other thing that they're doing is working on civic relationality. So they couple the online delivery of resources and online participatory spaces with in-person meetings, bringing together public officials, whether elected or appointed, and local members of their constituencies. And they have a really important rule, which is that in any given conversation, the ratio between constituencies or ordinary folks and citizens and the public officials has to be no bigger than 7-1. So no more than 7 people for every single elected official. So the point is that they are rebuilding a context where information is consumed and deliberated on in context of strong relationality. And it's that link between healthy relationality and information that is really critical to reversing the dynamics that we're currently experiencing. So we know there's an appetite for this. Everywhere I go, people express a sense of exhaustion with what the media landscape is delivering to them. So there is demand, all right? There's demand out there. And we're starting to figure out how to supply that demand. And so between the demand and the supply, there ought to be a business model in there. So we need a media entrepreneur who can see that demand for civic media, see the concrete things that count as filling it, and start to build on that.
And we ran a piece that I found really fascinating early in the pandemic by Jaron Lanier, the technologist, and the economist Glenn Whale on what Taiwan has done on civic technology and how a combination of kind of grassroots hacker movements and trusted public officials created a very, very much a kind of grassroots civic tech-driven response that has in fact been very, very effective, which I found kind of a fascinating model for the rest of us. So before we go to questions, for the sake of ending this part of the conversation on a constructive note, not to suggest that either one of you is an optimist, but I'm curious if if we could have the Alan Fukuyama Commission to address the failures in civic purpose and governance that have been so starkly exposed by the pandemic. What are the kind of 1 or 2 policy steps that you think we should take as a country that would have us better positioned the next time this comes? Danielle, I'll let you go first on this one.
It's funny that you should ask that because I was just sitting here thinking, I was asked just yesterday to nominate people for a commission of this kind. And I was just sitting here thinking, I'm going to nominate Frank. So there you go. It's going to happen. But at any rate, the first thing I would foreground is we need to invest in civic education. I recognize that that feels like it's a long way away from the immediate urgent needs of decision-making and governance. However, we can't actually effective governance without a population that both desires it and knows what it is. And all signs indicate that we no longer have a population that desires constitutional democracy. That is, we don't have a supermajority of support for constitutional democracy any longer because only fewer than 30% of people under 40 think it's essential to live in a democracy. That's a huge red alarm bell statistic. And relatedly, all the various surveys about civic knowledge and so forth indicate great erosion of people's understanding of our institutions and how to use them. We invest about $54 a year federally per kid on STEM education and 5 cents a year per kid on civic education. So you get what you pay for, all right? We can't govern effectively because we haven't actually put a lot of time into teaching folks how to do it.
I think that's a concrete recommendation as well. Frank, let me pass that to you, and you can.
Well, look, let me just start by, I don't like to be too overtly political, but any kind of reform really depends on the Democrats winning in November. I think if that doesn't happen, then things are going to get worse along very predictable lines, assuming that you have enough of a political base to actually start doing things. One of the issues is one that I've been actually pushing for a long time, which has been like rolling a big boulder uphill, which is essentially reform of our whole public sector and of the civil service. I think that Americans don't like bureaucrats, and that's why this has not been a popular issue. But I think that we've seen in both the impeachment hearings and now big time in this crisis, the fact that the United States has a government that's got lots of expertise, it's got a lot of agencies with a lot of state capacity, but because they've been denigrated and pushed aside by politicians in recent weeks and months and years, really, that hasn't benefited us the way it ought to. And I think that we need to restore something of the autonomy of those state institutions. We ought to prize expertise, and we ought to fix a lot of the problems that existed in that civil service, well prior to this crisis. So that would be the top of my list.
And that's a matter of fewer political appointees or more
political appointees. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be done. I think the other big issue is the one that Danielle raised earlier, which has to do with the social compact, because we got a broken healthcare system that is extremely unequal. They tried to fix this in 2010 with the Affordable Care Act, and half of the political system has been trying to dismantle that ever since then. And so I think if you actually don't have a system that can deliver access to health to all of your citizens, you've got a really big problem. And that's also another thing that'll be very urgent.
All right, well, I have many more questions, but I'm going to cede the floor to everyone else on the line. So Sam, a reminder, first of all, this is on the record, so don't say anything that you don't want in the public domain, and I will hand it over to Sam to call on questions or read out questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, to ask a question, please click on the raise hand icon on your Zoom window. When you are called on, please accept the Unmute Now button and proceed with your name, affiliation, and question. You may also type in your question using the Q&A box on your Zoom window at any time. We will take the first question from Kilaparti Ramakrishna.
Thank you very much. My question is about the discussion on young democracies and their success in dealing with COVID. I have lived in South Korea for about 8 years and just returned to the States. What I noticed there was there is a great deal of trust of the people in the government and in the institutions. But that does not mean that they don't throw out the government, and they have done that repeatedly through various protest movements and so on. But when we come to the United States, I mean, I take the point made about the elections. Of course, we will look for what happens in November. But what about the institutions? Why did they fail so horribly in dealing with the kind of crisis that we have? Thank you.
Well, I think that a lot of this is traced to what I had mentioned earlier, which is the underlying polarization. Now, South Korea's got polarizations as well, but it also has a longer tradition of state authority, which is true, I think, of really all of the states in East Asia that are within the Chinese cultural zone, and that includes South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and so forth. A lot of the protesters recently, the right-wing protesters, have been waving this flag with the rattlesnake, that says "Don't tread on me," and basically that's really about the state. I mean, it's this deep, deep distrust of state authority, and that's a way that the United States is really quite exceptional. That European countries don't have really the equivalent of that, and certainly the countries in East Asia have something of the opposite, where state authority tends to be honored, where expertise, in bureaucracy is one of the things that they have they've paid a lot of attention to. So I think that's one of the, elements of political culture that I think have really undermined our response.
Danielle, do you want to add to that?
No, I agree with those things. I mean, I guess the only thing I would add would be that, again, it's a little hard to convey the concept, but with regard to governance, the purpose of governance is judgment in this integrated way, to recognize that you have multiple objectives simultaneously, material security via health and economic resources, protection of civil liberties, and so forth. And we've lost sight of the fact that that's what the job of governance is. We've reduced it to the view that it's just about spitting out an answer from the scientists or spitting out an answer from the economists. And until we can recover a conception that governance is about understanding your overarching objectives, the ones that shore up your social compact to deliver safety and happiness, liberties to all, right? That's the overarching objective. You have to find the solution back to that. Until we can recover that definition of governance, we're not going to govern effectively.
And let me just make one more plug for the work that the group that you've convened at the Software Center has been doing, which I suppose quite consciously hearing you say this, brings together economists and epidemiologists and people from left and right, and has exactly that kind of conversation about integrated judgment like that. So it's totally fascinating reading, despite the white paper title. Sam, let's go to the next question.
Our next question is a written submission from Lori Garrett, who asked to Danielle, in your wonderful book about the Declaration of Independence, you end the book by saying, it is time to let the Declaration once more be ours, as it was always meant to be. A lot of young people in the streets now with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd protests might take issue, arguing independence was only for white men. You just told us we Americans need to review our social contract. Can we do so starting from the Declaration, and how?
We absolutely can. I just finished reading Benjamin Crump's new book. He's the attorney who represented Michael Brown's family and I think Trayvon Martin's family, and a long list of folks who have suffered from police killings. And I was astonished to see that his conclusion draws on the vocabulary structure of the Declaration of Independence. So I am not alone in my view that the Declaration of Independence is an excellent resource for diagnosing, in its words, the course of human events, being very clear that the job of our elected officials, of our government, is to secure rights, that the purpose of securing rights is to deliver safety and happiness, that when our institutions fail to secure rights for the sake of delivering safety and happiness, we ought to alter them. That's the argument of the Declaration of Independence. It is an argument that is pertinent across time and place. It's important that people recognize that the argument of the Declaration came as much from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin as from Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the scribe. There was a process of group thinking. Both Adams and Franklin were people who were against slavery. Adams never held slaves, enslaved people. He was not an enslaver. Benjamin Franklin was an enslaver earlier in his life, but he gave it up. He became an active abolitionist, actively, proactively pursuing abolition. John Adams used the language of the Declaration of Independence for the preamble of the Massachusetts State Constitution. That preamble supported the end of enslavement in Massachusetts in the years between 1780 and 1783. So enslavement was over in some states as early as 1780, and that flowed directly out of the intellectual work done in the Declaration of Independence.
Sam, let's go to the next question.
Our next question is from Michelle Gavin.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm a senior fellow at the council. I focus primarily on Africa. And I've been thinking a lot about these questions of trust, right? And what the pandemic shows us about where you find trust in different societies. So there's really good polling from a lot of African states that show there's a tremendously low level of trust in general in government institutions. Obviously, it varies country to country, but speaking generally, and it's usually the low levels of trust are usually correlated with perceptions of corruption, of sort of self-dealing in state institutions. So while I'm watching the response to COVID, I'm seeing these alternative voices of authority emerging, right, to provide clear information. It's community radio stations in some cases, it's imams in some places, it's sometimes it's pop culture figures, right, who actually are making a huge difference with, sort of putting to music their messages about hygiene, et cetera. So my question is, if in societies that are still sort of very young in terms of their governance model, right, they're sort of in a post-colonial governance model, when we see these sources, authentic kind of sources of trust and authority, how do you take that information? How do you take what's been illuminated about where trust is and link it up to governance structures? What's the connective tissue?
Frank, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, because I think if you look across all of the different voices that are trying to put out authoritative information, and this is not just in Africa, but in many other parts of the world, some of them express genuine grassroots, knowledge and legitimacy, and others don't. They've got contradictory messages, and they reflect different kinds of racial and ethnic and other regional sorts of divisions. And I think the reason that you want to have good liberal democratic institutions is that, given that pluralism of different voices, you need, as Danielle said, some mechanism that sorts through them, prioritizes them, and then actually arrives at a kind of social consensus. And so I think that this is an input to governance, these voices coming from the grassroots, but it's not governance itself. I think governance still does require those integrating institutions.
So I would say something similar. The American Academy of Arts and Sciences released a report about 10 days ago called Our Common Purpose, a reinvention of American democracy for the 21st century. And I was privileged to be one of the co-chairs for that report. Its core argument is that a healthy, flourishing constitutional democracy depends on a virtuous circle linking responsive, effective political institutions with civil society organizations that can bridge difference and connect people to their political institutions, with a civic culture that nourishes that social compact, that mutual commitment of people to each other and to their constitutional democracy. So what I would say in response to your question would be that the goal would be to figure out how civil society organizations can draw on those cultural resources to connect people to conversations taking place in political institutions. In some sense, I don't think you want a strictly unmediated connection of political institutions to influencers and culture, because that opens up the danger of propagandistic appropriation of culture for sort of problematic political purposes. That's why it's so important that civil society organizations be a bridge between the zone of culture and political institutions. It permits independence, it requires collaboration, it pulls individuals in society into decision-making processes, but in a way that also protects their autonomy, permits accountability with regard to elected officials and leaders and so forth.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Sam, let's go to the next one.
Our next question is a written submission from Jim Sebesta, who says, can you comment on lessons learned from any historical parallels in the U.S. with the degree of polarization that we are experiencing?
Danielle, do you want to start with this one?
So that's a hard one. Because obviously the worst case of polarization is the Civil War. So, lesson learned, avoid that. All right, then. So what are the paths that we have to avoiding that? I come back to that same virtuous circle that I articulated. Sometimes people ask the question, what's the one reform in our political institutions that would change something? Or what's the one sort of civil society organization that we need? I don't think the answer lies down that path. I think you have to work on all three things simultaneously. So it's not worth people's time to invest in finding compromise and working with others if their political institutions can't function in a way that supports compromise and collaboration. But conversely, if the institutions can't function that way, then or rather conversely, if nobody wants to participate in institutions of that kind, then institutions won't be able to be supportive of compromise and so forth. So I think we need reform along all three dimensions: institutions, civil society, and culture simultaneously. Keeping that in focus is really important. So I think, we need ranked choice voting. It would be my number one priority for helping to moderate our competition in the electoral space. Okay, good. Glad to hear it. There's that civic media concept that I articulated. And then, yes, we have to invest in civic cultural resources that are really about people connecting with people that they disagree with. And honestly, like literally starting out from friendship circles wherever you have them, and then building out to the next network. It's not a top-down solution. We actually have to rebuild the relationality that makes it possible for us to function together.
Frank, and kicking that to you, I'd also add, are there examples from other countries where this kind of polarization has been repaired?
Well, let's just stick with the United States. So I really like ranked choice voting, so I'm glad Danielle mentioned that. I would say that, there have been two cases, not the Civil War, in the United States. That were the elections of 1896 and 1932. In both cases, you had a lot of prior polarization, and basically it was solved by an election where one side won very, very decisively. And I actually think the 1932 election is probably the more relevant example, because you had a country that had been governed by the Republicans under conservative principles for the prior decade. They didn't deal with the Great Depression well. It worsened between the stock market crash in 1929 and then the bank failures in 1931. And it took a long time for this cognitive adjustment to take place, where people began to realize, actually tight money and fiscal austerity are probably not the right approaches to solving this economic crisis we're in. And then Roosevelt is elected, and the Democrats gain control of both houses of Congress, and then that lays the ground for the subsequent New Deal. So I do think that these things can be solved basically through electoral politics, but we'll have to see whether that's the way things are going to play out in this country.
Yeah, let's go to the next question.
Our next question is from Nanurul Kiohane. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to go back to Danielle's first point. I'm glad you mentioned the commission report on the common purpose, and a great many powerful arguments are made there. And the federal system should have helped us. But I wanted to question your focus on alignment as compared to conflict. It seems to me there are conflicts, painful conflicts, between health objectives, economic objectives, and civil rights, civil liberties. And I don't quite see how a government could ever have reached alignment in more than a superficial way without wrestling with those conflicts, making tough decisions that'll make some people unhappy. So I think governments have to do that as well as think in an integrated fashion. You don't get to an integrated fashion without solving the conflict.
So thank you so much, Nan, for your question. I don't fundamentally disagree with you. I would put it slightly differently, however. So it's not that trade-offs are irrelevant to the kind of integrative judgment I was describing, not at all. It's just that I think prior to a debate about trade-offs, one needs to ask the question about the optionality available for achieving alignment. That is, you have to actually test how much you can bring things into alignment before the trade-offs are clear. And we didn't actually do that. So in fact, the trade-offs were much less severe than we took them to be. If we had out of the gate pursued disease suppression via really beefed up diagnostic testing and contact tracing, we could have secured lives, livelihoods, and liberties simultaneously. We would have needed less in the way of stay-at-home orders. Taiwan did this, had positive GDP growth in the first quarter of the year, and we would have massively decreased the number of deaths. So we could actually have done much better on all three dimensions if we had pursued a different strategy. So that's what I mean when I say we didn't actually take the time to find the strategy that emerges when you actually pursue alignment.
Frank, anything you would add on the last question?
Yeah.
All right, next question.
Our next question is a written submission from Glenn Fukushima, who asks, assuming we see a change of administration on January 20, 2021, what are the three things the Biden administration should do to deal more effectively with COVID-19 and to reduce the tribalism and polarization that is inhibiting our ability to respond?
That's a big question, but we'll leave it at three things. Frank, do you want to start?
I'm sorry, me? The COVID thing, I think, is actually fairly easy, which is simply to focus the resources of the federal government on actually dealing, creating a strategy. I mean, that's the amazing thing, that even at this late date, the current administration does not really have a national strategy for dealing with a crisis that's obviously going to be with us for months to come. And creating that kind of response is not that difficult a thing. I mean, as Danielle was saying, if you'd followed this integrative strategy right from the beginning, you could have arrived at some sensible things to do. So that, I think, is important. The polarization one is, that's a really tough one. So it'll depend a lot, first of all, on what the election actually produces. If the Republicans continue to control the Senate, then I think that it's going to be actually pretty difficult outside of foreign policy for Biden to not suffer from what Obama suffered from in the last 6 years of his administration, which is divided government and, Republican obstructionism. If if the Democrats do retake the Senate and you have unified government again, then I think there are, that's when I think the 1932 scenario becomes more likely, where you do actually have a political consensus that you need deep changes in basic policies. And as I said before, where I would start is healthcare, because that's, the thing that has been laid most obviously bare by this crisis.
So I would say something pretty similar, but with a slightly different frame. So I would suggest that what a new administration should do should be to establish the foundation for pandemic resilience. Now, that does mean achieving suppression through a federal strategy in the first instance, but it also means remedying the vulnerabilities that left us unable to deliver that strategy at the get-go. So those vulnerabilities are that broken social compact. So it does mean actually getting us to a place where we have health access that's genuinely universal. Polarization is another one of those vulnerabilities. So it does actually mean pursuing the kinds of institutional reforms, including reforms presumably to the functioning of bodies like the Senate, that would reduce the polarization and get us back to a place where we can do cross-ideological joint decision-making, which you need for properly integrative judgment, it must be said. So there's more that could be said, but I think focusing on a concept of pandemic resilience so that we're not just solving this problem, but we can avoid them in the future. It's a lot like 2008, where the world had become vulnerable to its interconnection in our financial systems, and we didn't know it. We got blindsided. So we left 2008 having to correct for those blind spots. Same thing here. We have blind spots because of our global interconnection. They're going to continue to affect us. We want to be resilient in relationship to them. So that's that health infrastructure. It's our capacity to govern. That means conquering polarization.
I would just add that there's...
If I could just make a plug for ranked choice voting. I think that one of the institutional drivers of polarization is having a first past the post electoral system coupled with popular primaries. That's really what's driven the two parties towards the extremes, because it rewards activists, basically. They're the only people that vote in a primary. And the whole point about ranked choice voting is to open up space for third parties so that you can run against, for example, if you're primaried out as a Republican because you're too moderate, you can still run in the actual election. and you can hope to win because you can, the second choices get redistributed. And I think that's not a federal decision. That's really a kind of state and city level set of decisions. But if we could move to that kind of electoral system, I think that will do a lot to reduce the institutional drivers of polarization.
I would just add to Danielle's closing point that the piece by Michael Osterholm in the same issue makes a really kind of chilling argument that this pandemic, as bad as it is likely not the really bad one that we're going to face at some point. So it really underscores the need for that preparation for the next one. Sam, let's go to one more quick question before we wrap up.
Our last question is from Fred Hochberg.
Thank you. Of all the institutions political that we've talked about, it strikes me that the Senate is the most, one could say, dysfunctional, the most damaging. One, just in terms of a small minority of Americans elect senators and they have an outsized influence. And it seems the hardest to make change because when a party's in charge, they're not interested in making those changes because they've fought so hard to get there. So any thoughts on how we can address the Senate of all institutions?
All right, you each have 1 minute to fix the Senate. Danielle, do you want to start with this one?
Well, I'm not sure I have good answers as of yet, though I think it's an important question. So the Federalist Papers is very clear about the fact that the Senate is the rudder of our system. And for the obvious reason that the 6-year terms, they're the only, and because of the overlapping 2 by 2 by 2, they're the only body that's sort of continuously in existence without a complete transition. And as a result, they truly are the rudder. That is where we get our continuity from. So we need the Senate to function. And we need to address the fact that at this point, there's this incredible skew with regard to the percentage of population represented by the numbers of senators who hold, majority power. So I don't have answers, but I agree with you that the question of the functioning of the Senate is critical. I wouldn't myself want to move away from the equal state representation in the Senate. So for me, in that regard, I tend to focus on the question of the rules of Senate operating procedure. Where do we require majority votes? Where do we require supermajority votes, et cetera? I mean, that's a very arcane subject, but I suspect that the solution lies somewhere there.
Yeah, I think if the Democrats take both houses of Congress, you could actually bring up DC statehood. That would rectify the imbalance a little bit. Down the road, maybe California shouldn't be a single state. Maybe it should be 2 or 3 states.
All right, that is a good note to close on, I suppose. So thank you so much again to Danielle and Frank for the really wonderful essays and for joining us this morning. And thanks to everyone for listening. Sorry not to have gotten to all the questions, but very much appreciated in any case. So thanks so much, and hope everyone is staying healthy and safe.